So today's lecture is about the Schism of 1552 of the Church of the East. Why is it important? Because one of the long-lasting effects of this schism has been the creation or the reconstruction, if you will, of two separate identities, separate ethnicities, which are largely accepted today by many people, although I believe there's been a greater understanding of people rethinking their views on whether, for example, Chaldean and Assyrian are separate ethnicities. If they are separate, how did they become separate? Where did they come from? Are the origins, separate? Are there separate origin stories to the Chaldeans? Are the modern Chaldeans linked to the ancient Chaldeans? And of course, people have very strong views about these. And I should say both ways. And I really think that what is lacking in these discussions is an understanding of the historical background to all of this. I think it's going to be helpful to be more not only knowledgeable about the subject of how the names originated, but also more understanding of the development of identities as a human phenomenon, as a social phenomenon. So let's begin to discuss the Schism of 1552 and how it came about. One very important period of time is the 1400s, specifically an important event during this time is the Council of Florence, where we hear the first time officially the Roman Catholic Church encounters the Assyrians in the form of the Chaldeans. This term is being used, and it's being used alongside the word Syrian, but really to separate. And of course, in this class, I have discussed extensively the link between the word Syrian or Syriac and Assyrian, namely that they're of the same origin, etymological and otherwise historical. So we now begin to hear of the encounters given all of the upheaval in the world, the coming of the Ottoman Empire, the coming of the Mongols in the East, the various divisions within Europe itself, the doctrinal battles in Europe, England's departure from the Catholic Church, and so on. All of these things are causing the Roman Catholics to try to solidify themselves. And for the Eastern Christians, and specifically the Assyrians, it is a period of outreach to the West, really for help, not just, of course, Christological help, not just religious help, but also it is thought to be a period of material assistance. And this dependence on the West, if you will, is going to keep going for many centuries. In fact, it hasn't really ended up until this very day. Can't say that it's brought a lot of good for the Assyrians to depend on the West so much, but this is the situation. And so we have this proclamation from the Roman Catholic Church in a session in November of 1444. It's called the Bull of Union with the Syrians, this particular section. Quote, "Behold now again, with the Lord's help, other nations have gathered from afar, inhabitants of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, whose thinking about the procession of the Holy Spirit and some other articles had gone astray." End of quote. So the Catholic Church, in its infinite wisdom and understanding of Christology and the Christian faith, is really looking at the Eastern churches, and this includes, of course, the Greek Orthodox and others, that they have, quote unquote, gone astray, and they're in need of being brought back to the true faith. For the part of the Eastern Christians, of course, I'll stay on this screen for a second. For the part of the Eastern Christians themselves, it is an appeal to the West, really the papal states specifically, where there is a lot of wealth, there's a lot of power, there's a lot of influence, certainly much more than what the Eastern Christians have. And you have to understand, by this time, the Church of the East specifically, and the Assyrians in more general terms, and both the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Church of the East, there is no Chaldean Catholic Church at this time. Although we're going to discuss, and I'm going to explain how this term Chaldean came about, which is used for all of the people that we're talking about here. At this time, the Church of the East has taken quite a beating from people like Timur-Lang and other people who are Turkic or Mongol, who have swept from the east into the Mesopotamian plains and Assyrian mountains and wreaked havoc, along with the plagues that have caused a great deal of destruction and death in both Europe and the Middle East. So I was asked a question about Timur-Lang's effect on the Church of the East in the 1300s. By the time Timur-Lang has gone away, the Church of the East really has suffered dramatic changes, and it has nearly ended its existence in the Asian plains, in the Asian heartland, and really gone back, as it were, to its native homeland in Mesopotamia, specifically in Assyria and the northern mountains, in the form of later to be the Chaldean Church, the Church of the East, and the Syriac Orthodox Church, and later the Syriac Catholic Church. So what was happening in Europe at this time also has something to do with the outreach, both sides, east to west, Roman Catholics to the Assyrians or to the Chaldeans, as they are termed. These terms at this time are synonymous. And we're going to study the word Chaldean, but I'll just say one word about it right now to make it clear. The word Chaldean means nothing more than people of Mesopotamia who are speaking Sudeth, Syriac. The word Syriac is synonymous with the word Chaldean in terms of a language. In terms of an ethnicity, Assyrian, Chaldean really mean the same thing. Certainly to Westerners who are relying not so much on archaeological evidence or on intellectual pursuit in terms of knowledge about the Middle East. If they're relying on the Bible, they're thinking in terms of Ur of the Chaldees, thinking this is the ancient land of Chaldea from the Bible. And we're going to go into that. So it's not a matter of Assyrians versus Chaldeans. It's a matter of Chaldeans, Assyrians, Syriacs being the same thing as Mesopotamia and the biblical land of the Near East. So centuries of prosperity and growth in Europe came to an end. Europe has famines and plagues, which include the Great Famine of 1315 to 17 and the Black Death, which reduced the population to half what it was before. It's also struck with social unrest and warfare. France and England have a century of conflict, something called the 100 Years' War. To add to many problems of this time, the unity of the Catholic Church was temporarily shattered by the Western Schism. Collectively, these events are sometimes called the crisis of the late Middle Ages. And there are other changes in Europe that are significant. Martin Luther comes to the scene. There are various secular efforts that are expanding. The Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople and cause Christianity to, or Christendom as it is called oftentimes in Europe, to be fearful of itself coming to an end. So there's also printmaking in the 15th century. This increases literacy. Now, all of these events, all of these developments concern the Western Church, concern the Roman Catholic Church. All of the developments in the East that we're going to be talking about from 1300 to the 1500s are going to concern the Church of the East and its leadership and the Assyrian people. And now remember, I emphasize this point over and over again, but it's always good to keep in mind there are no secular political parties. For example, there are no organizations that we know of. Now, certainly there were tribal leaders, there were clan leaders, there were people who were merchants who possibly took leadership roles. But by and large, the church, remember the millet system is still in effect. The Church of the East is, and along with the Syriac Orthodox Church, is really the leadership, plays a central role. It is a gravitational force for the Assyrian people as a collective entity, and it plays a central role in the existence of the Assyrian people. So just to run down some affairs, some events going on in the Middle East during this time. 1303, a battle goes on in Syria where the Mongols are defeated by the Mamluks. This puts an end to their intentions to conquer Syria. 1347, fleet of Genoese trading ships is fleeing Kaffa, reaches the port of Messina and spreads the Black Death. This goes into the Middle East, of course. 1394 to 1465, appearance of modern firearms in the Ottoman Empire in Europe, and the Safavid Empire, the Iranian Empire, also picks up the modern firearms for the first time. 1453, critical period of time, the fall of Constantinople. This city was now a shell of its former self. It certainly was not. It was, of course, endured a lot from plagues, and its population had drastically dwindled down to something like 50,000 people. But its taking was a symbolic blow to Christianity by Islamic forces, by the forces of the Ottoman Empire. This period also is the classical age of the Ottoman Empire, where it grows to tremendous levels. 1500s, 1501 specifically, is the time of Safavid Iran. This is the time that Shia Islam establishes itself in Iran from top to bottom. It also is a time when the Safavid Empire grows. It's a growth period for Iran. 1516 to 1517, Ottoman Mamluk War. Ottomans seize Cairo in 1517, and in 1534, the Ottomans seize Baghdad and begin to press on Safavid Iran, later on Qajar Iran. 1550 to 1750 is a transformation of the Ottoman Empire, shifting from an expansionist state into a bureaucratic empire based on an ideology of upholding justice and acting as protector and representative of Sunni Islam. This is where the Sultan, Sultana, acts as the caliph for all of Islam and commands support, and he is viewed as so by Europe as well. 1300s is the time of Mario Ala. Of course, you see it written in different ways, but this is a common spelling. It's one of the few patriarchs of the Church of the East that is pictured in a miniature depicting a visitor from Italy who is kneeling before Mario Ala with his assistant. And he writes a letter to, and this is one of the first contacts between the Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church. And this is 1300s. Of course, this is 250 years before the official schism of the Church of the East. Mario Ala writes to Pope Benedict, making a profession of Catholic faith. This is what is given to us largely through Western sources. And his letter is not accepted by the rest of the Church of the East bishops, who are opposed to union with Rome, and so nothing materializes in terms of a union. This is the time also when the Church of the East undergoes a great deal of upheaval through the forces of the Mongols. Arbela had a fortress that the Church of the East resided in on July 1st, 1310. Fortress is captured by the Mongols, who massacre a great deal of the inhabitants. The Church of the East relocates itself to Marga, and then to Karimlish, then to Mosul, and then to Al-Qush. I neglected to put Mosul here. But this is, as you can see, a very turbulent time now for the Church of the East, having gone from the glorious age of Marti Matthias I, who we discussed last week, to this time where the seat of the patriarch is being moved around. And within a century, it moves from one place to another. It cannot remain stationary because of the upheavals in the Middle East. Now, in the Council of Florence, the bull of the Pope, which is the declaration of the Pope with the Chaldeans, with the Assyrian people who are members of the Church of the East. And this is when the Assyrians are living on the island of Cyprus. Quote, our venerable brothers, Timothy, Metropolitan of the Chaldeans, who have been called Nestorians in Cyprus until now because they used to follow Nestorus, and Elias, Bishop of the Maronites, who with his nation in the same realm was infected with the teachings of Macarius. Now, Macarius was a saint for the Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria, Egypt, together with a whole multitude of peoples and clerics subject to him in the island of Cyprus. To these prelates and all their subjects there, he delivered the faith and doctrine that the Holy Church has always cherished and observed. This shows us that the Roman Catholic Church is asserting itself. It is the superior faith according to itself, of course, and all of the Christians of the world really are coming to, at least the PR goes, according to many of these declarations, are coming to understand that the Roman Catholic Church is the true faith, quote unquote. And there's another quote. Again, now this terminology of the word Chaldean comes into play because in the council, many people came from different locations. And we are told that nobody shall in the future dare to call the said metropolitan of the Chaldeans and the said bishop of the Maronites or their clerics or any individual among them heretics, or to call Chaldeans Nestorians. And this is a trend that was, or a pattern of thinking that was instilled in the Eastern members of the Eastern Church or Church of the East, to the point where the word Chaldean became what one patriarch has described as almsgiving, an expression of respect, an expression of legitimacy, rather than this term, a misnomer, Nestorian, which is something that really is not an accurate depiction of the Church of the East's reference to itself. It's certainly not a self-designation. But this term Chaldeans, as we said, had roots in the biblical understanding of many of the Roman pontiffs. And so it certainly was an honorable term. It was also a term going back in time that was used by Greeks and Romans, anachronistically, of course, because one of the things they did not understand was that, for example, later Christians couldn't understand that Ur of the Chaldees really had no meaning historically, but the word Chaldee became associated with people living in Babylon. And later, because of its biblical usage and as a result of possibly misunderstandings of Greeks and Romans, got into the Old Testament, which was written during Hellenistic times, according to many scholars. This word became kind of a reference to the entirety of Mesopotamia. Now, the church in Cyprus still stands. And in fact, I was very surprised today that recently an Assyrian Rebella, a lady who just visited Cyprus, actually entered this church and saw it, and it's in not in very good shape at this time. But the church was built by Assyrians who settled in Cyprus after the fall of the Crusades in 1291. They were mainly merchants and apparently extremely wealthy who settled in Cyprus and built a church in the year 1359, it is thought. The interior is once thought to have contained rich and diverse frescoes and inscriptions in Syriac. Most have disappeared, but those that remain are in good condition, depicting saints. Of course, the depiction of saints is not the tradition of the Church of the East in the church, so these must have come later. The Ottomans turned the church into a stable for camels. Unfortunately, in the mid-19th century, church was converted to a Greek Orthodox. By this time, the Assyrian community or the Chaldean community in Cyprus had disappeared. It was following the Council of Florence that the Church of the East Patriarchs developed closer ties with Rome now, owing largely to increased European interaction. In the East, however, nothing comes of the first union, and the community in Cyprus eventually disappears. So we hear no more after a couple of hundred years, we hear no more of the Assyrian community in Cyprus or the Chaldean community in Cyprus. So let's stop and take a couple of steps back here and try to understand in a little more detail what this word meant to either the Romans or to the Assyrians themselves. What of the term Chaldean? How did it come about? And what I am showing you here is a painting of Abraham, who is coming out of Ur of the Chaldees, thought to be of the Chaldees, although most historians, most archaeologists, most Assyriologists, certainly most biblical archaeologists studying this question understand that Ur of the Chaldees is an anachronistic expression. It is superimposed on the ancient past because Ur had nothing to do with this word Chaldee in the actual past. So it's a type of a metaphor, perhaps. And also interesting here is you see camels. The use of camels did not result until a much later period. So this is coming from really in the future, writing about the past in kind of the past is a cloudy past here, and it is an imagined past based on what people knew during Hellenistic times of the ancient past. So what about the ancient Chaldeans? Well, surely there were ancient Chaldeans. Well, of course, there were. They inhabited an area in southern Mesopotamia, and that is where the arrow is pointing toward Ur and Eridu in Somar, in what the Assyrians sometimes refer to as the Sea Land. There were 5 main tribes of the Chaldeans, and they were identified by Assyrians as being the Keldu, Bet Yaqan, Bet Dakuri, Bet Amukani, and so on. These tribes lived in the southern area of Iraq. They are thought by historians to have migrated from the West because they are West Semites. They are Western Semitic speaking. Historians identify their home in southern Babylonia, or of course, Babylonia. I've told you this is a problematic term that again is anachronistic. But Babylonia refers to Somar and Ekkad, Somar being the southern part. Really, the Chaldeans inhabit in the southern part. So there's a reference by Strabo, in a Greco-Roman writer. There's also a tribe of Chaldeans who inhabit a district of Babylonia in the neighborhood of the Arabians and the sea called the Persian Sea. So what he's telling us during the late antiquity period is that this term Chaldean should be equated with southern Mesopotamia, not northern Mesopotamia. Both differentiate between the terms Chaldea, Chaldeans, and Babylonia, seeing in Chaldea only a region of Babylonia or Chaldeans as inhabiting parts of it. This view is at variance with other classical sources, including Borsos, for whom Chaldea and Babylonia were more or less synonymous. Borosis, I should say, excuse me, I mispronounced his name, was a writer who was thought to be Babylonian, but writing during the Hellenistic times. And he may have confused these terms, although sometimes this term for writers in the late antiquity period really meant magicians or stargazers at certain times, and certainly it's entered partially the Syriac language or the Assyrian language as such. And there are passages in writings in Hebrew, for example, that refer to the Chaldeans as a part of the Assyrian people, meaning they're the Chaldeans among the Assyrians. For example, the stargazers or the magicians among the Assyrians, that kind of expression. Now, there are certain historical figures that we know of that archaeology has discovered, and we know of them. One of them is Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar was, of course, the leader of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who led to the fall of Assyria, who led an army against Nineveh and later against Haran. And Olmsted in 1925 was the first to propose the designation of this word Chaldean to Nabopolassar. Olmsted also linked the family of Nabopolassar with previous Chaldean rulers of Babylon, although there's no direct evidence for this. The designation of Chaldean kings for the rulers of Neo-Babylonian Empire was taken up later by Weizmann in 1956. Now, is this true? Well, according to recent scholars, Paul-Elaine Beaulieu of the University of Toronto, there is zero reference. And he tells us that, for example, Nebuchadnezzar, we find only a couple of occurrences of the term Aramaean in sources from the time of Babylonian Empire, and in all cases in reference to single individual. Therefore, relying solely on cuneiform sources from Babylonia, which are relatively abundant, we find no evidence that Nebuchadnezzar considered himself the ruler of Chaldeans and Aramaeans, either one. So there is no such reference in history. And a careful study by an archaeologist in Israel, Ran Zadok, of cuneiform sources tells us that all of the references to Kaldu and Kaldayu collected by himself are from the period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Also notes the occurrence of Kur Kaldu, which was an inscription supposedly used by Nabonidus, and now it's been amended on the basis of context to reflect Kurlabni, which does not refer to Kur Kaldu. In other words, Nabonidus, who is the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, never really used the word Chaldean or Kaldu to refer as a self-designation, in other words, to refer to his empire or his city or his state. So where did the Chaldean term come from? How did we get so confused? One scholar tells us that biblical authors apparently perceived Babylon as a state ruled and led militarily by Chaldeans, by tribal leaders, West Semitic tribal leaders, especially Chaldeans. On the basis of this evidence, scholars have sometimes adopted the term Chaldean dynasty in reference to the royal house founded by Nabopolassar at the end of the 6th century. Saint Jerome, writing in 342 to 420 AD in the late antiquity, Jerome, who was a Latin priest, confessor, and theologian, remember the Greco-Latin or Greco-Roman writings about Mesopotamia being confused, used the term Chaldean for Aramaic or Syriac. And the very first dictionary in Latin and Syriac, you should know, is actually referred to as Chaldee, which is also a dictionary that is written by Martu Ma'odu, one of the greatest dictionaries in our language, in the Assyrian or Syriac language. is referred to in French as lexicon lingua Chaldean. In Assyrian, it is referred to, or in Surat, as Lexicon Lishana Suryaya, or Lishana Suraya. The term was inspired most likely by its use in the Bible for St. Jerome. That usage continued down the centuries, and it was still customary during the 19th century until the misnomer was corrected by scholars. What does that mean? That means today you don't really hear of the word Chaldean being used for the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's inappropriate and it is no longer used. So whenever you see the word Chaldean in reference to the ancient Neo-Babylonian Empire, you should know that that book or that source is relying on very old sources and is not an updated source. Scholars do not use this type of terminology anymore. Contrary to the Bible, rulers of the Neo-Babylonian Empire never refer to their subjects or their army as Chaldean. When we turn to terms describing members of the ruling class or the ruling dynasty, we encounter a similar paucity of information. While the biblical evidence has imposed the term Chaldean dynasty, Neo-Babylonian kings never adopted the designation Chaldean. Not only do we find no ancient claim for the Chaldean origin of the dynasty, but the term Chaldean does not appear even once in late Babylonian cuneiform documentation. So now that that's settled, when did we begin to encounter the word Chaldean being relived again among Assyrians? Well, as early as the 13th century, as we said, Catholic missionaries had been active among the Assyrians, specifically the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These are orders within the Roman Catholic Church. And these are typically orders that go and establish missionary activities in various places. There were some individual conversions, but no formal union up until this time. In the mid-1400s, a system of hereditary descent took place in the Ascension in the Church of the East. Quote, untrained minors were being elected to the patriarchal throne, according to one scholar. Church of the East was undergoing difficulties on top of this internal difficulty. Let's take a look at the map here to see the distance between the papal states, which are in central Italy. Remember, the Vatican's area was much larger than what it is today. It's been reduced drastically. And the Assyrians lived in Mesopotamia under the pressures of the Ottomans, and at times earlier under the pressures of the Mongols, under the pressures of the Arabs, the Safavids, and so on. So naturally, they're looking to their co-religionists, they're looking to their fellow Christians in the West, just as we said, Assyrians have always looked to the West for help since really almost soon after the fall of their empire. The Church of the East was really losing adherents during this time. In 1551, the community that used to be in Tabriz, in what is today Iran, disappeared. In Baghdad in 1553, soon after the Ottoman conquest. In Nasiban, 1556. In Jerusalem in 1616. The community had been there since 1065, so for about a period of 550 years. As well, Marogan Monastery in Tur Abdin was transferred to the Syriac Orthodox. Remember that much of this area was under the Church of the East, and the Church of the East kept losing these areas. During this time, the patriarch becomes, according to one scholar, a tribal prince rather than holding the venerable position that he held in the past. So how did it start? In the mid-1400s, this system of hereditary ascension took hold in the Church of the East. When the patriarch was elected in 1552, a group of Assyrian bishops refused to accept him and decided to seek union with Rome. Now, we have to understand this was not the majority of the bishops within the Church of the East. They elected a person often described as a reluctant abbot of a monastery, Youhanan Sulaqa, as their own patriarch and sent him to Rome to arrange for a union with the Catholic Church. In early 1553, Pope Julius proclaimed him Patriarch Simon the Eighth of the Chaldeans and ordained him a bishop in St. Peter's Basilica on April 9th, 1553. Excuse me. Now, some say he was not really ordained. He was not consecrated. He was really kind of certified or confirmed as patriarch. When Sulaqa returned to Assyria, he attempted to initiate reforms, but was met with strong opposition. He was soon captured by the Pasha of Amedia, by an Ottoman official, at the instigation of Marshammun, the patriarch of the Church of the East, let's say the traditional patriarch, tortured, executed in January, and he is thought to have been thrown into the river. Then began a struggle between the two branches of the Church of the East. So this is really the formation of the Chaldean Church and the Church of the East. One side being traditional, one side being the new Uniate Chaldean Church. Marshammun the Sixth and Marshammun Barmama, this is a family that lived in Al-Qush, are in the Rabban Hormus monastery. Marshammun had designated his brother, Marshammun Barmama, Marshammun the fourth, or excuse me, the sixth, had designated his brother, and he designated his nephew, Marshammun the eighth, as after, to take over after. The bishops of Arbela, Urmi, Salamis opposed this selection. In 1552, they selected Mar Youhanan Sulaqa. Sorry to repeat here. Mar Youhanan became Mar Youhanan the Eighth, but then became Marshammun with the Pope. Confusing enough? It is for me as well. He established initially contacts with Franciscans and then traveled to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem traveled to Rome. He stayed in Rome for 6 months. He was consecrated or affirmed, let's say, in Rome by Pope Julius III. He's sent back to Assyria with 2 Dominicans to educate Assyrians about the Roman Catholic faith. It is believed that Mar Youhanan Sulaqa had given the impression that Marshammun the Eighth had died. Marshammun the Eighth declares Mar Youhanan to be an illegitimate patriarch and, of course, has him assassinated. Now, one thing to remember about the establishment of the original Chaldean Catholic Church, it was established in the area of Diyarbakir, what is today Ahmed or Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey, and not, as is commonly thought, in the plains of Mosul. So typically when we refer to a Chaldean population among the Assyrians, or even a separate Chaldean population, we're largely talking about the Nineveh Plain area. But that's not where the Chaldean Church really was established when it was established in the 1500s. It was actually established in Diyarbakir, in a mountainous area in southeastern Turkey, quite a distance from the area of Mosul. And this is a photograph of Diyarbakir. And this was all under Pope Julius III. The Pope was a supporter of the rising Jesuit order. During his pontificate, the Catholic faith was temporarily restored in England by Queen Mary. So you have all these activities going on with the Catholic Church because there is loss and gain. This is a time when Martin Luther comes to succeed in establishing his separate Protestant church and Protestant ideas. And Pope Julius tries to gain some foothold in other places in addition to England. Unfortunately for him, he dies before he's able to do much in the future. Now, after Mar Youhanan Sulaqa dies or is murdered, Mar Odishu takes over. Only the Assyrians of Mardin and Diyarbakir follow Mar Youhanan Sulaqa and later Mar Odishu. On orders from Marshamun, he is arrested, tortured, and murdered. As we said, Mar Odishu is elected new patriarch of the Unate Church of the East. He's unable to travel to Rome initially, but Pope Pius, whose painting you see pictured to the right, recognizes him, and in 1556 sends bishops Mar Yosip and Mar Elias to Rome. He sends them to Rome to assure the Pope that he is a follower of the Creed. After Mar Odishu, the fourth period of confusion follows after his death. Marshamun Youalaha in 1577 succeeds to 1580. Marshamun Dincha then follows, the ninth, 1580 to 1600s. Now, something very strange happens during this time. Marshamun, coming from the line of Sulaqa, Marshamun Dincha, the ninth, coming from the line of Sulaqa and Odishu, the fourth, reinstates the hereditary succession, which was so controversial and which had led to the split of the Church of the East, and then moves the center of the patriarchy from Diyarbakir and Ahmed, crosses the border into Iran, and into Salamis, and then from there establishes his center in Qutanos, in the mountainous, very remote village of Qutanos. Marshamun Iliya then follows, Marshamun Ishu Yao, Marshamun Youalaha, and then Marshamun Dincha up until the 1700s, and so on and so forth until we get Marshamun Binyamin, who was murdered in 1915, and then Marpolis and Marshamun, Mar Ishe Shamun follow this same line and succeed until the end of this hereditary line in the 1970s when Mar Ishe Shamun is murdered in San Jose, California. And we're going to visit that in a great deal of detail in the future. The Marshamun line, the original traditionalist line, continued in Al-Qush. Marshamun Ishowiyo from the Barmama family, Mar Iliya, now they're called the Iliya line, and succeeding all the way to Mar Youhanan, to Mar Iliya, the 13th Ishuyo in 1804. When he passes away, there is a split from the Mar Iliya line, and Mar Youhanan Hormuz is elected, and he is recognized by the Vatican. There comes the end to the hereditary succession line in the line of Al-Qush, which now remember, going back to the line of Sulaqa, now it is retained in the line of Sulaqa. It disappears from the traditionalist line, and the traditionalist line makes contact with Rome, while the other line loses its contact with Rome. Well, there is another line at the same time. There is a third line in Ahmed, in Diyarbakir, that results in this in 1681. Now, this is, remember, the original Sulaqa line and the Odishu line, which where Odishu died and another patriarch was selected. That line has left, and a new line has developed, the Mar Yosip line, Mar Yosip the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and finally the fifth, and that brings to end this particular line in Ahmed in Diyarbakir. And here you see a photograph of a church, Mat Maryam Church in Diyarbakir. And of course, now Diyarbakir is strictly Syriac Orthodox, what is left of our people in this area. While the line most associated with the Church of the East today traditionally is, from the oldest kind of image that we have, is Mar Oraham Shummun in the Hakkari in the 1800s. And of course, today it is succeeded by Mar'awa with a smaller ancient church of the East. These are the lines that are associated with the line of Sulaqa, not with the original traditionalist lines, but this is the line that is associated with the line that split from the Church of the East, initially became Uniate, and then split from the church. And one interesting fact about the line of the Church of the East that continued to use this word Chaldean and transferred it, for example, to India, and I will make reference to that, is the line of Marshamun. If you look at the seal, I wish I had an image here, the seal of the Marshamuns who were in Qutsanus, you would note that it says patriarchate Chaldeia. And we explained, of course, where this word came from. It is a form of, as one patriarch put it, almsgiving to the Church of the East. So that word still continued on. Now, again, the word is not opposed to the word Assyrian. It is just an honorific, you could say, title that was used by our people, all of our people. So we have today, from this period, Syrian Chaldeans in India and Assyro-Chaldeans in France. This is really descending from the use of this word by Romans and Greeks and later by the pontiffs, the Roman pontiffs, and this word continued to live on among the Assyrian people. As people were educated, and this is a wonderful picture of three patriarchs of the Church of the East, Mar'ad to the left, Mar'ad II, Marrufail the first in the center, and Mardankha the fourth in the right. And this is a quote by Marrufail Bidawit, who was an educated patriarch, and he tells us that before I became a priest, I was an Assyrian. Before I became a bishop, I was an Assyrian. I'm an Assyrian today, tomorrow, forever, and proud of it. And one of the things he did as the Bishop of Lebanon was use the Assyrian star for the church that he had in Beirut, which survives to this day, very prominently displayed. And of course, Martuma Odu, who was a very learned bishop in the Chaldean Church in Salamis and Urmi in the 1800s and early 1900s, very clearly stated that the word Chaldean is in no way disassociating us from the word Assyrian and or the word Syriac or Suraya. So all of these three words really belong together. One was an expression of a biblical past, one could say. One was an expression that came out of the word Assyrian, Syriac, and he explains the word Suraya comes from Asuraya or Aturaya. And the other word, Assyrian, is really the proper designation for our people if one is speaking of nationality or ethnicity or culture or even geography. And this same point has been made repeatedly by different activists within the Chaldean Church, particularly secular activists who are educated about the history of their people using modern scholarship. Chaldeans are of the same stock and family as the Assyrians, and their language is one, etc. We hear this a lot. Now, contrary to such views are views of people like Amir Fatouhi, who's, I would say, in the very slight minority, although he does have some effect. And in one of his quotes, he's apparently written a couple of books, and I kind of look forward to see what exactly he's using, but he's been cited as using various forged documents and so on. But he says something like, quote, "There is no Assyrian ethnicity in the past and there will be none in the future." So he has this hatred, really. I mean, his expressions that pretend to be scholarly are really emotional expressions of hatred towards a segment, let's say, of his people who believe in something. So in the end, the very church that, I guess one could say, the line that had originally united with Rome and then separated from Rome, came back and had a Christological declaration in 1994, common Christological declaration between Mardoncha the Fourth, Patriarch of the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East, and Pope John Paul II, and stated in the end of that document, in thanking God for having made us rediscover what already unites us in the faith and sacraments, we pledge ourselves to do everything possible to dispel the obstacle of the past, which still prevent the attainment of full communion between our churches, so that we can better respond to the Lord's call for unity of his own, a unity which has, of course, been to be expressed visibly. And it has yet to be expressed visibly and formally. It has symbolically, of course, been an attempt by the Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, with the traditionalist branch that eventually changed, that has not been the case. That line has become fully unate and is increasingly been Romanized, although I must say of late, within the Chaldean Catholic Church, there has been a renewal of interest in language and culture and a kind of a distinct understanding of identity that is separate from the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church has kind of stepped back when it comes to reinforcing more cultural rather than faith matters.